A fresh start with lingering shadows. The sun shone brightly over Maplewood Avenue, a quiet suburban street where charm oozed from the neatly trimmed lawns and symmetrical homes. For Nina and Malcolm Hayes, this was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful, a fresh start. After years of scrimping and saving, they had finally moved their small family to a neighborhood they believed would offer their daughter, Lisa, a safer and brighter future. Lisa, an 8-year-old with a curious spirit and an ever-present sparkle in her eyes, stood on their new lawn, staring up at the towering oak tree that shaded their driveway. Her curls bounced as she twirled, imagining the adventures she could have in her new world. "Do you think we can put a swing on it, Mom?" Lisa asked, pointing to the strongest-looking branch. Nina, crouched over a box of gardening tools, paused to smile at her daughter. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's unpack first, okay?" Malcolm emerged from the moving truck, wiping his brow with a work glove. "Last box is in. What do you say we order pizza and call it a day?" Nina nodded in agreement, though her smile faltered slightly as she caught the watchful eyes of a neighbor peeking from behind curtains. It wasn't the first such glance today, and it left her with a strange feeling she couldn't quite place. Lisa didn't seem to notice. "Can we get pepperoni and extra cheese?" "Anything for my little girl," Malcolm said, ruffling her hair. Together, the family entered their new home, the screen door creaking closed behind them. Later that evening, the house buzzed with the sound of laughter and dreams as they ate pizza on the floor surrounded by unopened boxes. They shared their hopes for the future. Malcolm talked about his new job. Nina excitedly discussed her plans for her home office, and Lisa wondered aloud about making new friends at her new school. "You'll do great, honey," Nina assured her, though her heart felt a pang of worry. Being the only black family in the neighborhood would bring challenges she wasn't sure Lisa could fully understand. "Just be yourself," Malcolm added, squeezing his daughter's shoulder. "That's all you need to do." As the night wore on, and the boxes became makeshift tables for drinks and plates, Nina felt a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe this could work. Maybe this would be the new beginning they had dreamed of. The first day of school came quickly. Nina was up before dawn, packing Lisa's lunch and making sure her uniform was perfect. Lisa, usually bubbly, seemed unusually quiet as she stared out the window at the bus stopped down the street. "You nervous, sweetheart?" Nina asked, sitting beside her. "A little," Lisa admitted, clutching her new backpack. "Do you think the kids will like me?" "Of course they will," Nina said, forcing a reassuring smile. "You're smart and kind. Anyone would be lucky to be your friend." Malcolm joined them at the door, glancing at his watch. "Ready, kiddo. Butch should be here soon." Together, they walked Lisa to the end of the driveway. The yellow school bus rumbled down the street, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, leaned slightly out of his seat to look down at them. "You must be new," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "I'm Mr. Garrett. Welcome aboard." Lisa hesitated, her eyes darting back to her parents. Nina knelt beside her. "You've got this, baby. We're so proud of you." Taking a deep breath, Lisa climbed the steps. As the bus doors closed, Nina couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that gnawed at her. Malcolm must have noticed, because he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She'll be fine," he said. "She's tougher than we give her credit for." But Nina wasn't so sure. Lisa bounded into the house later that afternoon, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, the playground has a slide that twists, and my teacher gave me a sticker for answering a hard question." Nina felt a wave of relief. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Did you make any friends?" "There's a girl named Abby," Lisa said between bites of an after-school snack. "She said I could sit with her tomorrow." That night, as Nina tucked Lisa into bed, she leaned down to kiss her forehead. "I'm so proud of you, my brave girl." "Thanks, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." As Nina closed the door, she leaned against the hallway wall, letting out a deep breath. Maybe Malcolm was right. Maybe everything would be fine. But things would not stay fine for long. A strange encounter. It began subtly. Small changes Nina couldn't quite put her finger on. Lisa's once animated recounting of her school day became clipped and vague. It was fine, she'd say when asked, then change the subject. One evening at dinner, Malcolm asked about the bus ride. "How's Mr. Garrett? He seems like a nice guy." Lisa looked down at her plate, her fork poking at her mashed potatoes. "He's okay. Kind of mean sometimes." Nina's heart skipped a beat. "Mean how, sweetheart?" Lisa shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just mean." Neither Nina nor Malcolm pushed further, but Nina's mind churned with questions. What did mean mean? Was it teasing? Sarcasm? Something worse? The next morning, as Lisa climbed onto the bus, Nina watched closely. Mr. Garrett greeted her with a smile, but something about his expression made Nina's stomach tighten. It was fleeting, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Growing unease. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the Hayes household grew. Lisa seemed withdrawn, and Nina's attempts to get her to open up were met with resistance. One afternoon, Nina decided to follow the school bus. She stayed far enough behind to avoid suspicion, but close enough to see where it stopped and how Lisa interacted with Mr. Garrett. At each stop, Nina noticed a pattern. Lisa was always the last to board, and Mr. Garrett seemed to speak to her longer than the other children. From her car, Nina couldn't hear the conversations, but the sight of her daughter's slumped shoulders made her heart ache. When the bus finally arrived at the school, Nina parked across the street and watched as the children disembarked. Mr. Garrett patted Lisa on the shoulder as she passed. It seemed innocent enough, but Nina's unease only grew. That evening, as Lisa sat in her room, Nina entered and sat beside her. "Sweetheart, is there something you want to tell me about the bus rides?" Lisa shook her head, her eyes glued to the floor. "No, Mom. Everything's fine." But Nina knew better. Something was very, very wrong. Shadows in the light. Nina couldn't sleep that night. The image of Lisa's slumped shoulders and downcast eyes on the bus replayed in her mind like a haunting film. Every instinct screamed that her daughter was hiding something. But what? And why was she so afraid to speak? The next morning, as the yellow bus rolled up to their driveway, Nina found herself hesitating before letting Lisa go. "Remember, sweetheart," she said, crouching to her daughter's level, "if anything bothers you, you can tell me or your dad. We're here for you always." Lisa nodded but didn't meet her mother's gaze. Her fingers clutched her backpack straps tightly. "I know, Mom," she mumbled before stepping onto the bus. Nina watched the vehicle pull away, her heart sinking as Lisa disappeared behind the tinted windows. This time, she wasn't going to just stand by. She grabbed her keys and coat, determined to follow the bus again, but with a closer eye on every stop. A routine turned unsettling. Nina kept a safe distance as the bus made its first stop. A few kids climbed aboard, chatting animatedly as they greeted Mr. Garrett. He smiled at them, his demeanor warm and welcoming. Yet Nina noticed that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a subtle detail, one that most would dismiss, but to Nina, it felt like a crack in a polished mask. At the next stop, a small group of children rushed up the steps, their laughter filling the air. Again, Mr. Garrett smiled, but there was a fleeting glance, almost a scowl, when one of the younger boys tripped on the last step. The boy froze, his face pale, before scrambling to his seat. The bus moved on, and Nina's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She didn't want to overreact, but something about Mr. Garrett felt off. She reminded herself that she needed more than gut feelings to confront him or involve the school. When the bus finally arrived at the school, Nina parked discreetly across the street. This time, she stepped out of her car, pretending to check her phone as she kept her eyes on the bus. Lisa was the last to disembark again. Mr. Garrett leaned down to speak to her, his face obscured by the bus frame. Nina's breath caught as she saw Lisa nod slightly before hurrying away, her shoulders hunched. Nina's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let this go. Lisa's confession. That evening, Nina tried to keep things light at dinner. Malcolm asked about his daughter's day, and Lisa recounted a story about a new book her teacher had read to the class. She seemed happier than she had in weeks, but the light in her eyes dimmed when the topic of the bus came up. "Mr. Garrett is mean sometimes," Lisa said quietly, pushing her peas around her plate. Malcolm frowned. "Mean how, sweetheart?" Lisa hesitated, glancing between her parents. Finally, she shrugged. "He just says things." "What kind of things?" Nina pressed gently. Lisa fidgeted with her fork, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know. Stuff like, I don't belong here, and that people like us should go back to where we came from." Nina felt her stomach drop. Malcolm's grip on his glass tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Has he ever done anything else?" Nina asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Anything to make you feel unsafe?" Lisa hesitated again before shaking her head. "No, but he looks at me funny sometimes. And sometimes he stops the bus and makes me sit up front by myself." Nina's heart ached as she reached for her daughter's hand. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell us this before?" Lisa shrugged again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd believe me. He's nice to everyone else." The words hit Nina like a punch to the chest. She hugged Lisa tightly, whispering, "We believe you. Always." A plan in motion. After putting Lisa to bed, Nina and Malcolm sat in the living room, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. "This is serious," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. "We can't just ignore it." "I know," Nina replied, her mind racing. "But we need to handle this carefully. If we go to the school without evidence, they might dismiss it. And what if Mr. Garrett retaliates?" Malcolm nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then we get the evidence. We document everything." They decided to keep a closer eye on Lisa's bus rides, taking turns following the bus discreetly. Nina also planned to speak to other parents in the neighborhood, hoping to uncover any similar experiences. Uncovering a pattern. Over the next week, Nina followed the bus daily, making notes of anything unusual. She noticed that Mr. Garrett often glanced in the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on Lisa. At one stop, he seemed to hesitate before opening the doors, as if debating whether to let a child board. Nina also began talking to parents at the playground and during school events. Most praised Mr. Garrett, calling him a pillar of the community. But a few hesitated, their smiles faltering when she mentioned his name. There was one time, a mother named Danielle admitted reluctantly, when my son said Mr. Garrett yelled at him for being too loud. He said it scared him, but I thought he was just exaggerating. Another parent, a father named Mark, shared a similar story. "My daughter said Mr. Garrett didn't like kids who talked too much. I didn't think much of it at the time." The more stories Nina heard, the more convinced she became that Mr. Garrett had a pattern of targeting certain children, those who were quieter, different, or simply vulnerable. The breaking point. One rainy afternoon, Nina decided to follow the bus all the way to the depot after its final stop. As she watched from her car, she saw Mr. Garrett exit the bus, carrying a stack of papers. He glanced around before disappearing into the depot building. Nina's curiosity burned. What was he hiding? She waited until he was out of sight before stepping out of her car and approaching the bus. The rain masked her footsteps as she climbed the steps. The interior was dimly lit, and Nina's heart raced as she looked around. She spotted a clipboard on the dashboard and quickly flipped through the pages. Her breath caught when she saw Lisa's name circled in red, with the words "Watch closely" scribbled in the margins. Suddenly, a shadow loomed at the bus door. Nina turned to see Mr. Garrett standing there, his face a mask of fury. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice icy. Nina's heart pounded as she forced herself to stay calm. "I was just looking for something my daughter might have left behind. His smile was cold, his eyes hard. I think you should leave. Nina nodded, clutching her bag tightly, as she exited the bus. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just poked a hornet's nest. A mother's resolve. That night, Nina shared everything with Malcolm. He listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. We have enough, he said finally. It's time to go to the school. Nina nodded, but her mind was already spinning with plans. She wasn't just going to the school. She was going to make sure they couldn't ignore her. She would protect her daughter, no matter what it took. Little did Nina know, the storm she was about to unleash would reveal truths far darker than she ever imagined. Whispers of truth. Nina sat in her car in the school parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The words from her conversation with Malcolm the night before echoed in her mind. We can't wait any longer. They need to know what's happening. It was easy to agree when the idea was theoretical, but now, parked just steps away from the principal's office, doubt crept in. What if they didn't believe her? What if they dismissed her concerns as paranoia, or worse, branded her a troublemaker? The thought of being met with skepticism or outright hostility churned her stomach. Taking the deep breath, Nina grabbed the folder she had spent the last week compiling. Inside were notes, observations, and even printouts of comments from other parents who had shared troubling anecdotes about Mr. Garrett. It wasn't ironclad proof, but it was a start. Let's do this, she whispered to herself before stepping out of the car. The principal's office. The school building buzzed with the usual hum of activity, children laughing, teachers corralling their students, and the occasional squeak of sneakers against polished floors. Nina felt the weight of every glance as she walked through the hallways, the folder clutched tightly to her chest. When she reached the front office, the secretary greeted her with a warm, practiced smile. Good morning, Mrs. Hayes. How can we help you today? I need to speak with Principal Carter, Nina said, keeping her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. The secretary's smile faltered slightly. Is this about Lisa? Is she all right? Nina nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She's fine, but I need to discuss a matter involving her bus driver. The secretary hesitated for a moment before gesturing to a chair. Please wait here. I'll let the principal know you're here. As Nina sat down, she could hear murmurs coming from the hallway behind her. A few parents waiting to pick up their children threw curious glances her way. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on steadying her breathing. The meeting. Principal Carter's office was modest but inviting, with bookshelves lined with educational manuals and awards. The man himself, a neatly dressed middle-aged educator with salt and pepper hair, stood to greet her. Mrs. Hayes, please have a seat, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. How can I help you today? Nina sat, her hands trembling as she opened the folder. This is about Mr. Garrett, the bus driver on my daughter's route. Principal Carter's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Nina laid out everything. The changes in Lisa's behavior, the offhand comments she had overheard, and the troubling stories other parents had shared. She even mentioned her observations from following the bus. Carter listened quietly, his fingers steepled as he nodded occasionally. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Mrs. Hayes, he said finally. Mr. Garrett has been with us for over 15 years. He's well liked in the community, and we've never received a formal complaint about him. Nina's stomach sank. So, you're saying you don't believe me? I'm saying that we need to approach this carefully, Carter replied. If what you're saying is true, we need to ensure we have clear evidence before taking any action. These are serious allegations. I understand that, Nina said, trying to keep her voice steady. But what about my daughter? Shouldn't her safety come first? Of course, Carter said, his tone placating. I'll speak with Mr. Garrett and monitor the situation closely. In the meantime, I encourage you to document anything else you notice." Nina bit back her frustration. Document more. How much more did they need? But she forced a tight smile. "Thank you, Principal Carter. I hope you take this seriously." A fractured neighborhood. The ride home was silent, her thoughts racing. She felt dismissed, as though her concerns were a nuisance. The pit in her stomach deepened when she passed one of her neighbors, Sarah, who was walking her dog. Sarah offered a thin, forced smile that made Nina's skin crawl. The encounter from a week prior still stung. Sarah's hostility had been a stark reminder that not everyone in the neighborhood welcomed them. It wasn't just about Mr. Garrett. It was about the unspoken rules of a community that saw her family as outsiders. When Nina reached her driveway, she found Malcolm sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee. His face brightened when he saw her, but the smile faded as he took in her expression. "They didn't take it seriously, did they?" he asked. She shook her head, sitting beside him. "They said they'd monitor the situation." It felt like a brush-off. Malcolm sighed, his jaw tightening. "So, what now?" "We keep pushing," Nina said firmly. "If they won't act, we will. I'm not letting this go." A clue in the shadows. The next day, Nina decided to confront Mr. Garrett herself. She parked a block away from the depot and waited, her heart pounding as she rehearsed what she would say. When Mr. Garrett finally emerged, she stepped out of her car and called his name. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded irritation. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it? What brings you here?" Nina forced a smile. "I wanted to talk to you about Lisa." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What about her?" "She's mentioned some things," Nina said, keeping her tone calm. "About comments you've made. About how you treat her differently from the other kids." Mr. Garrett's face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "She's scared of you," Nina pressed. "Why would an 8-year-old be scared of her bus driver?" "I run a tight ship," he replied, his tone clipped. "Some kids don't like discipline." "Discipline?" Nina echoed, her voice rising. "Is that what you call dropping her off in the middle of nowhere?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Mr. Garrett's eyes, something cold and calculating. "I don't know what you think you know, Mrs. Hayes, but you're barking up the wrong tree. I treat all my passengers fairly." Nina stared at him, her blood boiling. "You don't scare me, Mr. Garrett. I will find out the truth." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't have proof yet, but she had seen enough in his eyes to know she was right. The breaking point. That night, Nina and Malcolm sat in their living room, poring over their options. "We need to escalate this," Malcolm said. "If the school won't help, we go higher." "What about the police?" Nina asked hesitantly. Malcolm hesitated. "It's risky. Without concrete evidence, it could backfire. But we can't just sit here." Before they could decide, Lisa came into the room, clutching her stuffed bear. Her eyes were red, and her small frame trembled. "Mom? Dad? What's wrong, sweetheart?" Nana asked, pulling her onto her lap. Lisa hesitated before whispering. "The bus driver said something today. He said, if I told anyone about what he says to me, no one would believe me." Malcolm's fists clenched, and Nana felt a wave of anger and guilt. They had waited too long. It was time to act. The call for help. The next morning, Nina called the police. The officer who answered listened patiently as she explained the situation, promising to send someone to their house to take a formal report. As Nina hung up, she felt a mix of relief and fear. This was no longer just a family issue. It was about justice for Lisa and ensuring no other child endured what she had. The battle was just beginning, and Nina knew it would be an uphill climb. But she was ready to fight. For Lisa, for her family, for the truth. The unveiling storm. The knock on the door came just as Nina finished setting out the breakfast plates. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she exchanged a tense glance with Malcolm before heading to the door. When she opened it, 2 officers stood on the porch, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a young woman with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor. "Mrs. Hayes?" the man asked, his voice steady. "Yes," Nina replied, stepping aside to let them in. Malcolm appeared in the hallway, his posture tense but composed. "I'm Officer Carter, and this is Officer Ramirez," the man introduced. "We understand you have concerns about your daughter's school bus driver." "Yes," Malcolm said firmly, guiding them to the living room. "Please, have a seat." The officers sat, pulling out notebooks. Ramirez leaned forward slightly. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" "A mother's testimony." Nina laid it all out. Lisa's behavior changes, the comments she had overheard, the troubling encounters with Mr. Garrett, and her own observations. As she spoke, Officer Ramirez took meticulous notes, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When Nina described the incident where Mr. Garrett allegedly dropped Lisa off in an unfamiliar area, Carter frowned. "You're saying he deliberately abandoned her?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Nina replied, her voice firm. "And he threatened her not to tell anyone." Ramirez glanced at her partner before addressing Nina. "This is a serious accusation. Has your daughter shared anything specific about the comments he's made or his behavior?" Malcolm cleared his throat. "She said he told her people like us don't belong in this neighborhood." Carter's mustache twitched. "And you believe this is racially motivated?" "I don't just believe it," Nina said, her voice rising slightly. "I know it." The room fell silent as Ramirez set down her notebook. "We're going to need to speak with your daughter." Nina hesitated. "She's been through a lot. I don't want her to feel scared." "We'll be gentle," Ramirez assured. "We just want to hear her side." Lisa's words. Lisa sat on the couch, clutching her stuffed bear, as the officers gently asked her questions. Nina sat beside her, holding her hand for reassurance. "Can you tell us about Mr. Garrett?" Ramirez asked softly. Lisa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't like me. He says things. Mean things." "What kind of things, sweetheart?" Ramirez pressed gently. Lisa hesitated, glancing at her parents before murmuring, "He said people like me shouldn't be here. He said my mom and dad think they're better than everyone else." Nina's heart broke as she watched her daughter struggle to find the words. "What else, baby?" she asked softly. Lisa's eyes welled up with tears. "He made me sit up front by myself. And one time, he told me to get off the bus. He said I was too much trouble." Ramirez and Carter exchanged a look, their expressions hardening. "Where did he drop you off?" Ramirez asked. Lisa sniffled. "I don't know. It was far away. I walked until I found a street I recognized." Nina tightened her grip on Lisa's hand, fighting back tears. Malcolm's jaw was set, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're very brave for telling us this," Ramirez said, her voice gentle. "We're going to look into it." The neighborhood reaction. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, neighbors were whispering and casting sidelong glances at the Hayes family. Nina felt their stares as she walked Lisa to the bus stop, her protective instincts on high alert. Sarah, the neighbor who had been hostile during their last conversation, approached with a saccharine smile. "Good morning, Nina." Nina didn't miss the falseness in her tone. "Morning. I heard about the situation," Sarah said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I just hope this doesn't cause any unnecessary trouble for the community." Nina's eyes narrowed. "Unnecessary trouble? My daughter was harassed by someone who's supposed to keep her safe." Sarah's smile tightened. "Well, Mr. Garrett has been here for years. He's always been wonderful to my kids." "Good for you," Nina snapped. "But my daughter deserves to feel safe too." Sarah's mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of disdain. "Maybe some people just don't fit in around here." Nina's temper flared, but before she could respond, the bus pulled up. Lisa climbed on, her head down, and Nina watched until it disappeared from sight, confronting the school. Later that day, Nina and Malcolm returned to the school, this time with Officer Ramirez. Principal Carter looked uncomfortable as they entered his office. "I thought we were handling this internally," Carter began, his tone defensive. "This is no longer just a school matter," Ramirez said firmly. "We're conducting an official investigation." Carter's expression tightened. "Mr. Garrett has been with us for over 15 years. He's a respected member of the community." "Respected or not," Malcolm interjected, "he's been targeting my daughter, and we have every reason to believe it's because of her race." Carter sighed. "I'll cooperate with the investigation, but I urge you to consider the broader impact this could have." "On who?" Nina demanded. "The community that already treats us like outsiders, or the children you're supposed to protect." Carter didn't respond. The breakthrough. A week later, Ramirez called with an update. "We've spoken to a few other families. While most have positive things to say about Mr. Garrett, we've found a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Nina asked. "Several parents mentioned that their children felt uncomfortable around him," Ramirez explained. "And we discovered another complaint from a few years ago. A parent claimed he acted inappropriately toward their child, but it was dismissed due to lack of evidence." Nina's blood boiled. "So this has happened before?" "It seems so," Ramirez said. "We're going to interview Mr. Garrett and see what he has to say." The confrontation. The day Mr. Garrett was called into the station, Nina and Malcolm waited anxiously at home. Hours later, Ramirez called. "He denied everything," Ramirez said. "But we found inconsistencies in his story. We're also pulling footage from the bus cameras to corroborate Lisa's account." "Why wasn't that done earlier?" Malcolm asked, his frustration evident. "It's a process," Ramirez replied. "But I promise, we're taking this seriously." The evidence. When the footage came in, it was damning. Clips showed Mr. Garrett singling Lisa out, forcing her to sit alone, and even making her exit the bus early. In one clip, he was caught muttering under his breath, though the audio wasn't clear enough to make out his words. Ramirez called the Hayes family into the station. "This is enough to move forward," she said. "We'll be pressing charges for child endangerment and discrimination." Nina felt a surge of relief, but also a pang of sadness. The fight wasn't over, not for Lisa, not for their family. But for the first time in weeks, she felt hope, the beginning of healing. As the news spread, the community's reactions were mixed. Some rallied behind the Hayes family, while others doubled down on their support for Mr. Garrett. But Nina and Malcolm didn't care. Their priority was Lisa. One evening, as Nina tucked Lisa into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide eyes. "Is it over, Mommy?" "Not yet, sweetheart," Nina said. "But it will be. And no one will ever hurt you like that again." Lisa smiled faintly, her hand slipping into Nina's. "Thank you for believing me." Nina's heart swelled. Always, baby. Always. The cost of courage. The headlines hit the local news the next morning. Respected school bus driver under investigation for discrimination and child endangerment. The bold print was accompanied by a photo of Mr. Garrett, his face stern and unrepentant. The sight of it sent a jolt of mixed emotions through Nina. Relief that the truth was coming to light, but also anger and fear about the storm it would bring. The Hayes family was no stranger to being watched, but now the stares were sharper, more pointed. As Nina walked Lisa to the bus stop that morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Neighbors avoided her gaze or whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "There's always one family trying to stir up trouble," a woman muttered to her husband as they passed. "Can you believe they went this far?" Another voice whispered, "It's like they're trying to ruin his life." Nina held her head high, but inside, her nerves were fraying. She gave Lisa a quick hug before she climbed onto the bus, now driven by a temporary substitute driver, and waved until it disappeared down the street. Malcolm met her at the door when she returned home, his expression grave. "Did you see the news?" "I did," Nina replied, setting her bag on the counter. "It's already started." He nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. I got a call from HR this morning. Apparently, someone sent an anonymous email to my company, saying I'm part of a troublemaking family. It wanted to make sure I wasn't a liability. Nina's stomach churned. Are you serious? Malcolm, that's harassment. I know, he said, his tone bitter. But they were careful not to say anything outright. Just a heads up, they called it. Nina's heart ached with guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't think. This isn't on you, Malcolm interrupted, taking her hands. We did the right thing, Nina. But we need to be ready. This is only going to get worse before it gets better. Isolation and defiance. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. Lisa's school called twice, once to request a meeting to discuss how they could support her emotional well-being, and again to inform Nina that several parents had expressed concerns about the investigation disrupting the learning environment. Disrupting the learning environment, Nina repeated incredulously as she hung up the phone. How about the man who's been threatening my child, disrupting her safety? Malcolm, who had been sitting at the kitchen table reviewing work emails, sighed. They're circling the wagons. Garrett's been here for years. People don't want to believe someone they know could do this. Wanting to believe it or not doesn't change the facts, Nina said, pacing the room. We have footage, witnesses. And yet, Malcolm said grimly, they'll try to bury it. Lisa seemed to sense the tension. Though she smiled when she came home from school, Nina noticed her shoulders were still hunched, her laughter less frequent. One night, Nina found her daughter sitting on her bed, staring at the stuffed bear she always clutched for comfort. Sweetheart, what's wrong? Nina asked, sitting beside her. Lisa hesitated, biting her lip. Why do they hate us, Mommy? The question cut Nina to the core. She pulled Lisa into her arms, holding her close. Oh, baby, they don't hate us. Some people are just afraid of what they don't understand. But why? Lisa whispered. I didn't do anything wrong. You didn't, Nina said firmly. And you never have to apologize for who you are. People like Mr. Garrett, people who act like that, they're the ones who are wrong, not you. Lisa nodded against her chest, but her small frame trembled. Nina held her tighter, silently vowing to shield her daughter from as much of the world's ugliness as she could. The community pushback. The investigation stirred up more than just whispers and stares. Flyers began appearing on neighborhood bulletin boards and car windshields. Support Mr. Garrett, they proclaimed in bold letters, accusing the Hayes family of trying to ruin a man's life over misunderstandings. One morning, Nina found a note taped to their mailbox. It read, "Go back to where you came from. You don't belong here." She crumpled the paper in her fist, her vision blurring with tears of anger. Malcolm found her standing in the driveway, shaking with fury. They think they can scare us, she said through gritted teeth. They think they can silence us. They don't know who they're dealing with. Malcolm replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Let them try. We're not going anywhere. But the hostility wasn't limited to anonymous notes. At the grocery store, a man bumped into Nina with deliberate force, muttering, "Watch where you're going." At school pickup, a mother loudly complained about outsiders causing drama, while standing just a few feet away. Even Lisa wasn't spared. She came home one day with her backpack scrawled on in marker, "Troublemaker." Nina's hands trembled as she cleaned the bag with soap and water. Lisa sat silently at the table, her head bowed. "You're not a troublemaker," Nina said gently, kneeling beside her. "You're a fighter, and fighters don't give up." Justice inches closer. Despite the resistance, the investigation continued. Officer Ramirez kept the family updated, sharing snippets of progress. "We're building a strong case," she said during a phone call. "The footage and your daughter's testimony are key. But we've also uncovered a history of complaints against Garrett, ones that were quietly swept under the rug." Hearing this was both validating and infuriating for Nina. "So this could have been stopped years ago," she said bitterly. If someone had just listened. It looks that way, Ramirez admitted, but we'll make sure it ends here. Finally, after weeks of tension, the police announced that charges were being filed. Garrett was arrested and formally charged with child endangerment and harassment. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Some rallied behind the Hayes family, offering words of support and encouragement, but others doubled down on their animosity, organizing protests outside the school and the police station. One evening, as Nina scrolled through social media, she stumbled upon a post from a parent she barely knew. It read, "The Hayes family is destroying a good man's life over nothing. They're the real problem in this neighborhood." Nina wanted to scream. Instead, she closed her laptop and turned to Malcolm, who sat beside her. "Why do they hate us so much?" "They hate what we represent," he said quietly. "Change, accountability. And they'll fight tooth and nail to protect their comfortable little bubble." The trial begins. When the trial date was announced, Nina braced herself for the ordeal ahead. Lisa would have to testify, a prospect that filled Nina with both pride and dread. Her daughter was strong, but the thought of her facing a room full of strangers, and Garrett himself, was almost too much to bear. On the morning of the trial, Nina knelt in front of Lisa, straightening her dress and brushing her curls. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Lisa nodded, her small hand gripping her bear. "I'm scared," she admitted. "That's okay," Nina said, cupping her daughter's face. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when it's hard." Lisa took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "Okay, Mommy, I'll do it." As they walked into the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and protesters, Nina held her daughter's hand tightly. She glanced at Malcolm, who gave her a reassuring nod. They had come too far to turn back now. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. For Lisa, for justice, for every child who had been silenced, and every parent who had fought to be heard. The reckoning. The courtroom was a sea of tension, the air so thick it seemed to hum. Rows of spectators filled the benches, from supporters of the Hayes family to those who had come to defend Mr. Garrett. Cameras clicked incessantly as reporters tried to capture every moment of the high-profile trial. Nina sat at the plaintiff's table, her hand tightly gripping Malcolm's. Lisa sat between them, her small frame dwarfed by the size of the courtroom, but her resolve was evident in the determined set of her jaw. In her lap, she clutched the stuffed bear that had been her constant companion through these trying weeks. Across the room sat Mr. Garrett. His face was calm, almost smug, as though he couldn't comprehend how his actions had led him here. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, whispered something in his ear, prompting a curt nod. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, signaling the judge's entrance. The room stood as Judge Eleanor Prescott, a stern woman with an air of authority, took her seat at the bench. The trial was officially underway. The prosecution's case. The prosecution began with a straightforward opening statement, laying out the facts of the case. They described Mr. Garrett's pattern of behavior, his targeted harassment of Lisa, and the damning evidence captured on bus footage. As the evidence will show, the prosecutor concluded, Mr. Garrett abused his position of authority to intimidate and discriminate against a vulnerable child. This cannot and will not be tolerated. Next came the witnesses. Nina was the first to testify. Taking the stand, she recounted the changes she had seen in Lisa, the growing unease, and the pivotal moment when her daughter confessed what had been happening. "I knew something was wrong," Nina said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I didn't know the extent of it until Lisa finally told us. Mr. Garrett made my daughter feel unsafe every day. He made her question her worth, and no child should ever have to feel that way." The defense attorney attempted to rattle her during cross-examination, implying that she had overreacted and misunderstood the situation. But Nina held firm. "I followed the bus," she said pointedly. "I saw the way he treated her compared to the other children. I didn't misunderstand anything." Lisa's testimony. The most pivotal moment came when Lisa took the stand. Dressed in her Sunday best, she looked impossibly small in the large wooden chair. Judge Prescott leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Miss Lisa, you understand that you're here to tell the truth, right?" the judge asked. Lisa nodded, clutching her bear tightly. "Yes, Mom." The prosecutor approached gently, crouching slightly to meet Lisa's gaze. "Lisa, can you tell us about the things Mr. Garrett said to you?" Lisa's voice was quiet but clear. "He said I didn't belong. He said my family thought we were better than everyone else. And he said people like me should go back to where we came from." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Nina's hands clenched in her lap as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "What else did he do, Lisa?" the prosecutor asked. Lisa hesitated, her lip trembling. "He made me sit up front, away from everyone else. And one time, he made me get off the bus. He said I was too much trouble." The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "That must have been very scary." Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know where I was. I just started walking." When the defense attorney stood for cross-examination, Nina's heart sank. She had dreaded this moment. "Lisa," the attorney began, his tone measured, "you mentioned that Mr. Garrett said mean things. Is it possible you misunderstood him?" Lisa shook her head firmly. "No, he said I didn't belong. I know what he meant. And when he asked you to sit up front, could it be because he wanted to keep an eye on you for your safety?" "No," Lisa replied, her voice rising slightly. "He only made me sit up front. No one else." The attorney pressed further, but Lisa didn't waver. By the time she left the stand, Nina felt a swell of pride. Her daughter had been brave beyond her years. The defense's argument. The defense built their case around Mr. Garrett's good reputation, calling on character witnesses who painted him as a kind and dependable man. Parents testified about how he had driven their children for years without incident, how he always greeted them with a smile. "He's a pillar of this community," one parent said emphatically. "He would never intentionally harm a child." But their narrative began to falter when the prosecution presented the bus footage. Clips showing Mr. Garrett isolating Lisa, speaking to her sharply, and ultimately making her exit the bus painted a very different picture. "This is not the behavior of a man who treats all children equally," the prosecutor argued. "This is the behavior of someone who deliberately targeted a child based on her race." The verdict. After days of testimony and arguments, the case was handed to the jury. Nina and Malcolm sat in tense silence, Lisa nestled between them as they waited for the verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air crackling with anticipation. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. "On the count of child endangerment," he read, "we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Nina's heart raced as the foreman continued. "On the count of harassment with a racial motive, we find the defendant guilty." The words hit Nina like a wave. Relief, vindication, and a flood of emotion coursed through her. She reached for Malcolm's hand, squeezing it tightly. Beside her, Lisa let out a small, relieved sigh. Judge Prescott addressed the court. "This case serves as a reminder that no one is above accountability. Discrimination and abuse of authority have no place in our society. Sentencing will follow, but for now, this court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters shouted questions, supporters cheered, and detractors muttered angrily. But Nina heard none of it. All she could focus on was Lisa's face, calm, relieved, and for the first time in weeks, truly at peace. The aftermath. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The sentencing hearing brought closure, with Mr. Garrett receiving a significant sentence for his crimes. The school district issued a public apology to the Hayes family, vowing to implement better oversight and anti-discrimination training. Not everyone in the community accepted the outcome. Some neighbors remained cold, their hostility simmering beneath polite smiles. but others stepped forward with words of support, small acts of kindness that reminded the Hayes family they weren't entirely alone. One evening, as Nina and Malcolm sat on the porch, Lisa playing in the yard, a car pulled up to their driveway. It was Officer Ramirez. "I just wanted to check in," she said, leaning against the porch railing. "How's Lisa doing?" "She's doing better," Nina said, glancing at her daughter, who was laughing as she swung from the oak tree. "I think she's finally starting to feel safe again." Ramirez nodded. "She's an incredible kid. You should be proud." "We are," Malcolm said. "And we're grateful to you for believing us." Ramirez smiled. "It's my job. But more importantly, it's the right thing to do." A new chapter. Months later, the Hayes family began to feel the weight of the ordeal lift. Lisa's confidence returned, her laughter more frequent. Nina started volunteering at the school, determined to ensure no other child endured what Lisa had. One night, as Nina tucked Lisa into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mommy, do you think people like Mr. Garrett will ever stop being mean?" Nina paused, considering her answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know this. You showed everyone that even when people are mean, you can stand up to them. And that makes the world a little bit better." Lisa smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Nina kissed her forehead and turned off the light, a sense of peace settling over her. The fight had been hard, and the scars would remain. But as Nina stood in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep, she knew they had won something far greater than a court case. They had won back their voice, their dignity, and their future. The healing process. In the weeks following the trial, life began to settle into a new normal for the Hayes family. The hostility from parts of the community lingered, but it was tempered by growing support. A group of parents from Lisa's school formed a committee to address bullying and discrimination, inspired by the Hayes family's courage to speak out. Nina joined as a founding member, her resolve stronger than ever to ensure that no child endured what Lisa had. Lisa returned to school with her head held higher than before. Her teachers, aware of the ordeal, went out of their way to make her feel supported. At recess, a few classmates who had previously kept their distance began inviting her to join their games. Slowly but surely, Lisa began to rediscover the confidence and joy she had lost. One afternoon, as Nina watched Lisa play on the swings in their backyard, Malcolm came outside with 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her and sat beside her on the porch steps. "She's smiling more," Malcolm said, nodding toward Lisa. "It's good to see." "She's resilient," Nina replied, her voice filled with pride. "But I hate that she had to be." Malcolm sighed, staring into his tea. "I know. But maybe what we went through will help someone else. Maybe it'll change things." "Maybe," Nina said softly. "I just hope it means she'll never have to fight a battle like this again." A community divided. While some in the neighborhood had come to embrace the Hayes family, others remained cold. Sarah, their once hostile neighbor, avoided eye contact when they passed each other on the street. Other families who had supported Mr. Garrett continued to whisper behind their backs, but Nina had learned to let those things roll off her shoulders. One evening, Sarah surprised Nina by knocking on her door. When Nina opened it, she found the woman standing awkwardly on the porch, clutching a plate of cookies. "I'd wanted to apologize," Sarah said, her voice hesitant, "for how I acted before. I didn't believe you, and I was wrong." Nina studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot." Sarah handed her the plate and offered a weak smile. "I hope we can all move forward." "We're trying," Nina replied. "One step at a time." Lisa's voice. Months later, Lisa stood in front of her class during an assignment about heroes. She had chosen to speak about her parents. "My mom and dad are my heroes," she said, her voice steady as she looked out at her classmates. "Because when something bad happened to me, they believed me. And they'd fought for me, even when it was hard." Nina, who had been invited to watch the presentation, felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. Lisa's teacher smiled warmly and led the class in a round of applause. As they walked home that afternoon, Lisa slipped her hand into Nina's. "Do you think I'll ever have to fight like that again?" she asked. "I don't know, sweetheart," Nina said honestly. "But if you do, I know you'll be brave. And you'll always have us by your side." Lisa nodded, her small fingers tightening around her mother's. "Then I'm not scared." The end of a chapter. A year after the trial, Nina stood on the porch of their home, looking out at the oak tree that had become a symbol of strength for her family. The swing Malcolm had installed swayed gently in the breeze, its creak a comforting sound. Malcolm joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's been a year," he said softly. "Can you believe it?" "No," Nina admitted, "but look at how far we've come." They watched as Lisa ran across the yard, laughing with two new friends from school. Her face was alight with joy, her laughter ringing out like a melody. It was a sight Nina had feared she might never see again, and it filled her with gratitude. "We did the right thing," Malcolm said, echoing words he had spoken so many times before. Nina nodded. "We did, and we'll keep doing it for her." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a golden glow, Nina felt a profound sense of peace. The battle had been long, and the scars remained, but they had emerged stronger. They had shown Lisa and the world that standing up for what's right was worth every struggle. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nina allowed herself to believe in the promise of brighter days ahead. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had found the light.